cold open. They told him to speak up. His whole life, every room he walked into, teachers, managers, coaches, family, everyone said the same thing. Speak up. Be louder. Assert yourself. Say something. And he did. He talked more. He argued more. He explained himself. He defended himself. He filled every silence because silence felt like weakness. And he lost. Every time. He lost the negotiation. He lost the argument. He lost the respect of the room. He watched quieter men walk away with everything he wanted, the promotion, the loyalty, the authority, and he couldn't understand why. Until the day he stopped. Not forever. Not in defeat. But deliberately. Strategically. With the cold precision of a man who finally understood something most people never learn. Silence is not the absence of power. Silence is the power. And today, we're going to break down the 3 forms of silence that separate men who command rooms from men who beg for attention in them. This is not theory. This is not philosophy for a lecture hall. This is the rule that Marcus Aurelius lived by, that Seneca wrote about in private letters he never meant for the public, that every high-stakes negotiator, every general, every man who has ever bent history to his will has understood. The rule of the 3 silences. Let's begin. The first silence, the silence before you speak. There is a moment, barely a second long, that most men throw away. It happens right after someone finishes talking. Right after a question is asked. Right after a challenge is thrown in your direction. And in that moment, almost every man on earth does the same thing. He rushes. He rushes to fill the space. He rushes to answer. He rushes to prove he's present, engaged, competent, not caught off guard. And in his rushing, he gives away everything. He gives away his composure. He gives away his depth. He gives away his ability to think clearly under pressure. And most importantly, he gives away control of the conversation. The first silence is the pause before you respond. It sounds almost embarrassingly simple. But almost no one does it. And the ones who do, they carry rooms. Think about what the rush actually communicates to everyone watching. It says, I was not prepared for this. It says, your words affected me enough to make me react before I thought. It says, I need to fill this space because the space is uncomfortable, and I am not comfortable with discomfort. Every one of those signals erodes your authority. Now think about what the pause communicates. It says, I heard you. It says, I am considering what you said as if it deserves real consideration. It says, when I speak, I will have something worth hearing. And underneath all of that, it says, I am not afraid of this moment. I am not threatened by this silence. I have nowhere else to be but here. That is the signal of a man in control. The story of Cato the Elder. In the Roman Senate, during the height of the Republic, there was a man named Cato the Elder, known across the ancient world not for his physical power, not for his wealth, but for his ability to silence a room before he even opened his mouth. His contemporaries wrote about it. When a senator would make an argument, sometimes a long, passionate, elaborate argument, Cato would sit. He would let the words settle. He would let the room breathe. And then, after what must have felt like an eternity to his opponents, he would speak. Just a few words. Measured. Precise. Devastatingly clear. His most famous phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, was not shouted. It was not performed. It was spoken after a silence that forced every man in that Senate to lean forward. He had learned something that most Roman senators never did. The man who speaks last controls what is remembered. Plutarch recorded that Cato himself once said he had never regretted silence, but had often regretted speaking. Let that land. A man who shaped the course of Roman civilization, one of the most powerful political figures in the ancient world, said his greatest discipline was knowing when not to talk. His enemies, and he had many, described his silences as maddening. They never quite knew what he was thinking. They could not read him. They could not anticipate him. And that uncertainty gave him a psychological advantage before a single word left his mouth. He was not being calculating for the sake of manipulation. He genuinely believed, as a Stoic, that words were among the most powerful tools a man possessed, and that any tool used carelessly becomes dangerous. He treated every public statement as a loaded weapon that required care before deployment. The pause was not his tactic. It was his character. Here is what the pause actually does, physiologically and psychologically. When you pause before answering, you signal to every person watching that you are not afraid of the moment. Fear rushes. Fear fills silence. Fear cannot tolerate a gap. So when you sit in the gap without flinching, without apologizing, without performing, people register it. Even if they can't name it, they feel it. You are communicating, without a single word, that you are not reactive. And in a world full of reactive men, a man who does not react on demand is automatically elevated. The pause also forces something remarkable. It forces the other person to sit inside whatever they just said. If they said something unfair, they feel it more. If they said something stupid, they hear it again in the silence. If they made a threat or a challenge, they have to watch you absorb it without flinching, which immediately deflates the threat. You have seen this in every negotiation breakdown in history. The side that speaks first in a silence breaks first. The side that speaks second wins. There is a reason that experienced negotiators will sometimes just stop talking and wait. They know that the other party will fill the silence. And in filling it, they will reveal their anxiety, their bottom line, their uncertainty. The man who is comfortable in the quiet of his own authority never needs to fill the silence, and that comfort itself is leverage. Practice the pause. Not as a manipulation technique. Not as a performance. But as a discipline. Every time you feel the urge to rush, stop. Breathe once. Let the silence exist. Then speak from a place of clarity, not anxiety. That single habit, practiced consistently, will change how every person in your life experiences you. Most men waste their first second. You are going to own it. The second silence, the silence while others talk. There is a difference between hearing and listening. Most men hear. They sit in a conversation, they pick up sounds and words, and while the other person is talking, they are building their response, preparing their rebuttal, thinking about what they're going to say next. They are present in body and absent in mind. Real listening is silence of the mind while another person speaks. This is the second silence, and it is rarer than any other form of human self-discipline. Because the ego hates it. The ego wants to talk. The ego wants to compete. The ego wants to be heard, not to hear. And so most men listen only long enough to find their next opening. But the man who practices the second silence, the man who genuinely, deeply, with full presence listens, becomes something that almost no one in the modern world is. He becomes someone people cannot stop talking to. Think about the people in your own life who have made you feel most understood. The conversations you remember years later. The mentors, the friends, the rare strangers who left you feeling like you had been seen. Were they the best talkers? Were they the most eloquent, the funniest, the most impressive? Almost certainly, no. They were the best listeners. They were the ones who looked at you while you spoke. Who asked questions that proved they heard not just your words but your meaning. Who didn't interrupt to tell you about their own experience. Who let you finish, fully finish, before they responded. That experience is so rare that when it happens, it feels almost spiritual. Because it is so far from what most people receive on a daily basis. The story of Theodore Roosevelt and the Buffalo Soldiers. Before Theodore Roosevelt became the 26th President of the United States, before San Juan Hill, before the Rough Riders, before the White House, he was a young man in the Dakota Territory trying to become something. Roosevelt wrote in his letters and journals about a quality he had to deliberately learn, listening without interrupting. He described himself in his youth as impulsive, loud, eager to fill every gap. And he wrote about the ranchers and frontiersmen he met in the Dakotas, men who said almost nothing, who listened with an almost unsettling completeness, and how those men commanded the deepest respect in every environment they entered. He studied them. He began practicing what he called complete attention, giving whoever was speaking the full weight of his presence, eyes, mind, body. No partial listening. No planning his next sentence while they were still on their current one. Years later, when he became president, this quality became legendary. Roosevelt's biographers consistently noted that every person who met with him, foreign diplomats, labor leaders, journalists, war veterans, left the meeting feeling that they had been the most important person in the room. Not because Roosevelt agreed with them. Not because he was warm or accommodating. But because when they spoke, he was entirely there. His political aides said this single quality gave him an intelligence advantage that no briefing document could replicate. Because when people feel genuinely heard, they reveal themselves. They share what they actually think, what they actually fear, what they actually want. And the man who is truly listening, who is practicing the silence of mind while another person speaks, collects that information. Not to exploit it, but to understand. And understanding is a form of power that cannot be faked or bought. One of Roosevelt's closest advisors described watching him in meetings and being struck by something, that when Roosevelt finally spoke, it was as if he had heard things that no one else in the room had heard. As if the same conversation had given him more information than it gave everyone else. That was the second silence in action. The second silence is also a form of respect that people can feel in their bones. In a world where everyone is half present, where conversations happen between two people staring at phones, where meetings end with nobody quite sure if they were heard, the man who gives complete attention gives something almost no one else gives. He gives the rarest resource on earth, his full, undistracted presence. And people respond to it in ways they can't fully explain. They trust you more. They confide in you. They want you in their corner. They advocate for you in rooms you're not in. Not because you said the right things, but because you listened in a way they've almost never experienced. There is also a tactical reality here that Seneca understood and wrote about in his letters to Lucilius. He wrote, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen twice as much as you speak, and you will find yourself twice as wise as those around you." The man who is quiet while others talk gathers intelligence. He hears what people don't say as much as what they do. He notices where someone's voice tightens, where they hedge, where they over-explain. He watches the gap between a man's words and his body. And from all of this, he builds a picture that the talker never sees, because the talker is too busy talking to observe. Practice the second silence. When someone is speaking, kill the internal monologue. Stop building your response. Stop thinking about what you'll say when they're done. Put all of it down. And be entirely where you are. This is harder than any physical discipline. The mind does not want to be quiet. The ego does not want to yield. But the man who masters this silence becomes the most powerful listener in any room, and powerful listeners build powerful lives. The third silence. The silence after you've already won. This is the rarest silence. And it is the one that separates boys from men. You've been in this situation. You made your point. You won the argument. You had the facts, the logic, the moral high ground. The other person had nothing left. And in that moment, in the moment of victory, the ego surged forward. Keep going. Rub it in. Make sure they understand exactly how wrong they were. Make sure everyone in the room sees that you won. And you kept going. You pushed further. You explained again. You restated the point. You made the wound deeper than it needed to be. And in doing so, you lost. Not the argument. But something more important. You lost the room. You lost the dignity of the moment. You lost the respect that your victory had just earned you. Because there is nothing that collapses a man's status faster than winning and then being unable to stop. The third silence is the discipline of knowing when to stop. And the reason it's so hard is precisely because it feels unfinished. The ego doesn't experience victory. The ego only experiences the gap between where it is and where it wants to be. So even when you have won, the ego is already looking for the next thing to win. The next point to make. The next piece of acknowledgement to extract. It is never enough for the ego. But the man who practices the third silence has stepped outside his ego. He has looked at the situation from the perspective of the room, of history, of his own highest standard, and he has decided, this is where I stop. Not because I have lost, but because I have won, and I am man enough to leave it there. The story of Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. April 9, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The American Civil War, 4 years of the most brutal, devastating conflict the country had ever seen, was effectively over. General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, had no path forward. He had requested a meeting. Ulysses S. Grant arrived in a private's uniform, mud-splattered, having ridden hard to reach the meeting. Lee arrived immaculate, dressed in his finest uniform, sword at his side. 2 men from 2 different worlds, meeting in a small parlor to end the bloodiest chapter in American history. Grant had won. By every measure, strategically, militarily, politically, he had won completely. The entire Union Army was behind him. History was behind him. He could have humiliated Lee. He could have demanded full, public, unconditional surrender with maximum ceremony. He could have marched Lee's army through Washington in chains. The political appetite for it existed. The public appetite for it existed. Grant did none of it. He allowed Lee's officers to keep their sidearms. He allowed the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses. He ordered his own men not to celebrate, not to fire guns into the air, not to cheer, not to mock. He simply said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." He chose the third silence. Historians have argued for over a century that Grant's restraint at Appomattox, his refusal to humiliate Lee in victory, did more for the long-term reunification of the United States than any battle he won. Because a man who could have crushed his enemy and instead offered dignity, that man became something more than a general. He became the architect of peace. Lincoln had told him, "Let them down easy." But Grant didn't need the instruction. He already understood the rule. When you've won, silence is more powerful than celebration. Lee wrote afterward, in private correspondence, of his respect for Grant. Not for his military genius, but for the humanity of that moment. The silence that followed the victory. The hand that was offered instead of the fist that could have been raised. That is what the third silence creates, not just an end to the conflict, but the conditions for something better to grow in its place. The Stoics called this principle magnanimity, the greatness of soul that chooses restraint when force is available. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it in Meditations. The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. The third silence applies not just to arguments and confrontations. It applies to every victory in your life. You get the promotion. The third silence says, don't announce it to every person who doubted you. Let the outcome speak. Don't perform gratitude for people who didn't help you. Don't explain your path to people who weren't interested until you made it. You build your body. You achieve the goal. The third silence says, don't seek validation. Don't post every progress photo for applause. Don't make other men feel small so you can feel big. Let the work exist without narration. You make it through the hard season, the breakup, the financial collapse, the loss, the years of grinding in obscurity. The third silence says, you don't owe anyone your story of suffering. You don't need to perform your resilience. You don't need people to understand what it cost you. The third silence is the discipline of the man who knows his own worth, so thoroughly, so completely, that he needs none of it confirmed by anyone else. He has won. He knows it. And he is already moving to the next thing. The 3 silences as one rule. Most men spend their entire lives practicing the opposite of these 3 silences. They rush to fill every gap before a word leaves their mouth. They half listen while building their next sentence. And when they win, they cannot stop, because the win doesn't feel real until someone validates it. And the tragedy is that in doing all of this constant noise and rushing and performing, they get less of what they want. Less respect. Less trust. Less influence. Less peace. Because noise is not power. Movement is not momentum. Words are not wisdom. The three silences are not passive. They are not the silence of the man who has nothing to say, or the man who is afraid to speak, or the man who has been beaten into compliance. They are the silence of the man who has done the inner work. The story of Viktor Frankl in the death camps. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist. He was also a prisoner of Auschwitz, Dachau, and 3 other Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. He lost almost everything: his wife, his parents, his professional work, every material thing he had built. And in the camps, he observed something that would become one of the most profound psychological insights of the 20th century, that the men who survived, not just physically but spiritually, were the men who had mastered a particular kind of internal silence. The silence between stimulus and response. Guards would humiliate prisoners. Other prisoners would steal. Cold would set in. Hunger would become permanent. Disease would take people daily. And in all of that suffering, Frankl observed that the men who maintained their dignity were the men who had found a space, a tiny, silent space, between what happened to them and how they chose to respond. He wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space is silence." The three silences, the pause before speaking, the quiet of mind while listening, and the restraint after winning, are all expressions of that same space. The space where the reactive animal stops and the thinking man begins. Frankl survived Auschwitz. He went on to write Man's Search for Meaning, one of the most widely read books in human history. He built a new life, a new practice, a legacy that outlasted every person who held power over him in those camps. Because even in hell, he refused to let go of that space. That is what silence is. Not a passive withdrawal from the world, but the active, disciplined claim of the one thing no one can take from you. The space between what happens and who you choose to be. Why most men fail at silence. Here is the honest truth about why silence is hard, and it is not the reason most people think. It is not hard because of external pressure. It is not hard because of social awkwardness or conversational norms or the expectation to respond quickly. Silence is hard because it forces you to be alone with yourself. And most men, most people, are terrified of that. When you stop filling the space with noise, with talking, with reaction, with performance, you are left with the truth of who you are in that moment. Your doubts become audible. Your fears become visible. The questions you've been avoiding with constant activity suddenly surface. Am I enough? Do I actually know what I'm doing? What if they see through me? What if this doesn't work? The noise drowns those questions out. The rushing, the talking, the constant filling of silence, these are not communication strategies. They are defense mechanisms. The man who cannot be silent cannot face himself. The story of Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was a 17th-century French mathematician, physicist, and philosopher, a man of extraordinary intellect who understood something about the human condition that most people in his time, and most people in ours, refused to accept. He wrote, in his collection of thoughts called Pensées, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He wasn't being poetic. He was being precise. Pascal observed that men, wealthy, educated, powerful men, would rather go to war, embark on exhausting adventures, plunge into political intrigue, or fill their days with empty socializing than simply sit with their own thoughts for an hour. Because in the silence, the truth of their condition would appear. And the truth, that they were mortal, that they were often wrong, that they didn't have as much control as they pretended, was unbearable. So they fled into noise, into distraction, into busyness. Pascal died at 39. He spent his last years in monastery-like stillness, sitting with the deepest questions he knew, about God, about meaning, about what a human life was actually for. His writings from that period are some of the most honest, precise, and searching pieces of philosophy ever written. Because only in silence could he actually think. This is the foundation of all three silences. Before you can practice the pause before speaking, before you can practice full presence while listening, before you can practice restraint after winning, you have to be able to tolerate being in your own mind. You have to do the work of knowing who you are when there is no audience. This is what the Stoics called the inner citadel, the fortress of the self that no external event can breach. Marcus Aurelius returned to it again and again in Meditations. Epictetus built his entire philosophy on it. The idea that there is a place inside every man, a place of clarity and stillness, that is completely beyond the reach of the world's chaos. But you cannot access that place if you are always running from it. Silence is the door. The man who speaks less commands more. There is an old proverb that appears in one form or another across almost every culture on earth: still waters run deep. The man who says little is the man people watch. Not because he is mysterious for the sake of mystery, not as a game or an act, but because his silence signals something real. It signals that he thinks before he acts. That he has considered what is worth saying and what is not. That he is not driven by the need for approval or the fear of being ignored. In any group, any team, any office, any social environment, the man who speaks least and most precisely is the one people turn to when something actually matters. Because everyone in the room has learned through experience that when this man speaks, it is worth hearing. Compare that to the man who fills every silence. Who volunteers opinions nobody asked for. Who speaks before he thinks and then backtracks and clarifies and restates. People tune him out. Not because they disrespect him as a person, but because the signal-to-noise ratio of his communication has taught them to treat his words as background. The story of Abraham Lincoln's silence before Gettysburg. On November 19, 1863, at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 2 men gave speeches. The first man was Edward Everett, one of the most celebrated orators in American history, a man renowned for his eloquence and command of language. He spoke for 2 hours. His speech was brilliant, technically accomplished, deeply researched. The crowd listened with respect. The second man was Abraham Lincoln. He spoke for 2 minutes. 2 minutes. 272 words. The Gettysburg Address. Everett wrote to Lincoln afterward, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln had learned through decades of hard experience, as a lawyer, as a congressman, as a president navigating the most fractured political landscape in American history, that economy of language was not a limitation. It was a weapon. He chose every word with silence surrounding it. He knew what to leave out. He understood that the white space around a sentence is what makes the sentence land. Most people remember the Gettysburg Address. Almost no one remembers Everett's speech, despite it being objectively more elaborate and technically impressive. Because brevity, rooted in real thought, lands in a way that volume never can. The man who speaks less commands more. Not as a performance, but as a natural consequence of having the discipline to think before he opens his mouth. Silence in relationships, the power you don't know you have. Let's talk about something that most self-improvement content avoids, because it is uncomfortable and because it goes against conventional advice. In your relationships, all of them, but particularly the closest ones, your silence is one of the most powerful things you possess. Not the cold silence of punishment. Not the passive-aggressive withdrawal of a man who doesn't know how to communicate. Not the shutting down of a man who has been emotionally beaten into avoidance. The deliberate, warm, grounded silence of a man who is fully present and chooses what he says carefully. Most men have been trained, by culture, by upbringing, by fear, to over-explain themselves in relationships. To justify their decisions. To argue their case. To perform their love, their loyalty, their stability, their ambitions, out loud, constantly, seeking confirmation that the person they love sees them correctly. This is exhausting. And it is fundamentally backward. A man who constantly explains himself signals that he is not sure of himself. And a man who is not sure of himself cannot provide the kind of stability that real relationships are built on. The story of Seneca and Paulina. Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in ancient Rome, had a wife named Paulina who was significantly younger than him. He married her late in life. And in his letters he wrote about love with a precision that most men never reach. He wrote that the greatest thing a husband could do for his wife was not grand gestures or elaborate words, it was steadiness. Presence. The sense that whatever came, he was not going to be destabilized by it. He described what he called the unmoved center, the man who could absorb the chaos of the world and return to his wife and family as the same person. Not performance. Not a face he put on. But a genuine rootedness that could only come from inner work. When Nero eventually ordered Seneca's death, Paulina wanted to die with him. And Seneca, even in his final hours, was described by witnesses as calm. Not resigned. Not broken. Calm in a way that made the people around him calm. He had spent a lifetime practicing the silences. He didn't need to perform courage in that moment. He had been practicing it in every ordinary silence for decades. Silence in relationships is the man who doesn't react to every emotional fluctuation. Who doesn't need to win every argument. Who can sit in tension without needing to resolve it immediately. Who can be honest without being brutal. Who can hold space for another person's emotion without being pulled into it or shutting down in the face of it. This man becomes an anchor. And anchors are irreplaceable. Practice the 3 silences in every conversation you have today. With your partner. With your children. With your colleagues. With the person who challenges you, provokes you, pushes your buttons. The pause before you speak. The quiet of mind while they speak. The restraint that knows when you've said enough. When silence becomes dangerous, knowing the difference. There is something that needs to be said here, because the message of silence can be misread. There is a silence of strength. And there is a silence of fear. The silence of strength is the pause of a man who thinks before he speaks. The full listening of a man who respects the person talking. The restraint of a man who has won and does not need to punish. The silence of fear is the man who doesn't speak up because he is afraid of conflict. Who doesn't advocate for himself because he has been conditioned to believe his needs don't matter. Who stays quiet when injustice happens because standing up feels too costly. Who swallows his truth, day after day, until it turns into resentment and bitterness and a slow collapse of self-respect. These 2 silences look the same from the outside. But they feel completely different on the inside. The silence of strength is chosen. It is deliberate. You could speak, you are choosing not to, because it serves your higher purpose. The silence of fear is compelled. You want to speak, but you cannot, because something inside you has been broken or suppressed. The rule of the 3 silences is only about the first kind. If you are quiet because you are afraid, the work is not to practice more silence. The work is to do the inner reckoning that gives you the foundation to speak, and then to speak from that foundation, even when it is hard. Seneca wrote about this distinction clearly. He said that the man who is silent because he has nothing to prove and the man who is silent because he has been beaten into submission may look the same at the dinner table, but one is a king and one is a prisoner. Only you know which one you are. The story of Frederick Douglass finding his voice. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland in the early 19th century. He had no rights, no education, no legal personhood. The entire machinery of a system designed to silence men like him had been built over 200 years. And Douglass, illegally, secretly, at enormous personal risk, taught himself to read. He later wrote that the moment he understood the power of language, the moment he connected words to liberation, was the most important of his life. Not because it gave him freedom immediately, he would not escape for years, but because it gave him the internal conviction that he was a man. That his thoughts mattered. That the silence being imposed on him was not his silence. It was a cage. When Douglass finally escaped and began speaking publicly, first in small church halls in Massachusetts, then to increasingly large crowds across the northern states, and eventually across England, he became one of the most powerful orators in American history. But what made his speaking devastating was not its volume. It was its precision. Its earned authority. Its roots in suffering that had been digested, understood, and transformed into something that could move other human beings. He had learned the difference between the silence that crushes and the silence that builds. Know which silence you are practicing. And if you are building toward the courage to speak, keep going. This is the work. The silence that rebuilds, after the fall. Every man goes through seasons of destruction. The relationship that ends. The business that collapses. The reputation that takes a hit. The health that breaks down. The version of yourself that you were certain about, and then you weren't. In those moments, the noise is deafening. The internal noise, the self-blame, the what-ifs, the replaying of every decision that led here. The external noise, other people's opinions, advice, judgments, observations you didn't ask for. The cultural noise, the pressure to process everything publicly, to perform your grief and your recovery for an audience, to be seen bouncing back before you have actually bounced back. All of it is noise. And none of it helps. What helps, what actually rebuilds a man after he has been taken apart, is silence. Not the silence of despair, but the deliberate, courageous silence of a man who has decided, before I speak about this, before I explain this, before I perform recovery for anyone, I am going to sit in this until I understand it. That silence is where the real reckoning happens. In the stillness after a loss, things become clear that the noise was keeping hidden. You see, sometimes for the first time, what you actually wanted versus what you thought you wanted. What you actually value versus what you were performing. What kind of man you have been, honestly, without the flattering stories, and what kind of man you intend to become. The story of Theodore Roosevelt after Alice. On February 14, 1884, Theodore Roosevelt lost two of the most important people in his life on the same day. His mother died of typhoid fever early in the morning. His wife, Alice, died of kidney failure later that same day, just 2 days after giving birth to their daughter. Roosevelt was 25 years old. He was already a New York State Assemblyman, a rising political figure. And in a single day, his world ended. In his diary that night, he wrote only a large X. And beneath it, "The light has gone out of my life." He left his daughter with his sister. He went to the Dakota Territory. He went into the wilderness. For 2 years, he almost never spoke of Alice publicly. He worked, brutal, physical, exhausting work, as a rancher and hunter and lawman. He rode for days in bitter cold. He rounded up cattle. He arrested horse thieves at gunpoint. He pushed his body to its absolute limit in the silence of the American frontier. He was not running away. He was sitting in the silence of his grief until he was strong enough to carry it. When he came back, 2 years later, rebuilt in ways that the comfortable life of a New York assemblyman never could have built him, he was a different man. Harder. Deeper. More capable of genuine compassion because he had experienced genuine loss. More capable of genuine courage because he had survived genuine despair. He went on to become one of the most consequential presidents in American history. The silence after the fall didn't destroy him. It made him. Whatever fall you are in, whatever season of destruction or loss or confusion you are navigating, the silence is not your enemy. The silence is where the rebuilding happens. Sit in it. Do the work. Come back when you are ready. Not for the audience. For yourself. The daily practice. How to begin. Let's make this practical. Philosophy without practice is entertainment. And Inner Steel is not an entertainment channel. This is a workshop. Everything here is meant to be carried into your actual life, into your actual days, into the actual moments where it is hard. Start your morning in silence. Before the phone. Before the news. Before the notifications and the noise. Give yourself 10 minutes, just 10, in quiet. Sit with your coffee or your water or nothing at all. Let the mind settle. Review who you intend to be today. Not in a performative way. In a private, honest, nobody is watching way. This is what Marcus Aurelius did. This is what every serious man who has ever studied himself has discovered. The quality of your day is set in the first quiet minutes before the world arrives. Practice the pause in every conversation. Before you respond, even to a text, even in a low-stakes interaction, notice the urge to rush. And slow it down by one breath. One beat. You don't have to be obviously slow. The pause doesn't have to be theatrical. Just fractionally longer. Just enough to ensure that what comes out of your mouth comes from you, not from your anxiety. Set a listening challenge. Once a day, have at least one conversation where your only job is to listen. Not to respond, not to advise, not to relate it back to your own experience. Just listen. Ask one follow-up question. Listen to the answer. Ask another. You will be stunned by what people reveal when they feel genuinely heard. Practice the win stop. Next time you are right, next time you have won a point, made a successful argument, come out ahead, stop. Don't gloat. Don't keep going. Don't explain again. Just stop. Let the silence do the work. You will feel the discomfort of the ego wanting more. Sit in that discomfort. It will pass. And what remains is the dignity of a man who doesn't need the last word. End your day in silence. Give the day a few minutes of quiet review before you sleep. A quiet, honest accounting. Where did I practice the silences today? Where did I fail? What do I carry forward? These are not massive, dramatic changes. They are small, daily, private disciplines. But compounded over months and years, they produce a man who is almost unrecognizable compared to the reactive, noisy, constantly performing version of himself that he used to be. They produce a man who is genuinely formidable. Not because he has performed formidability, but because he has built it, silently, consistently, one pause at a time. The world needs fewer words from you. We live in the loudest moment in human history. There has never been more noise. More content. More takes, more posts, more broadcasts, more performances of self. Every platform rewards volume. Every algorithm rewards reaction. Every cultural signal tells you that if you are not speaking, you are not present, and if you are not present, you do not matter. This is a lie. In an ocean of noise, the man who can be quiet becomes extraordinary. Not because quiet is inherently valuable, but because genuine thought, genuine presence, genuine restraint are so rare that they read as power. You have watched this dynamic work in your own life. The person in the meeting who speaks least but says the most precise, most considered thing, they carry weight. The person who posts rarely but whose content, when it appears, everyone stops to read, they have real influence. The friend who doesn't give advice constantly but when they speak, you actually listen, that person changes your life. Scarcity creates value. When your words are rare and considered, they become precious. When they are constant and reactive, they become background. The story of Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. Calvin Coolidge was the 30th President of the United States, and he was famous for almost never speaking. His nickname was Silent Cal. A woman at a dinner party once bet him she could get him to say more than 2 words. He looked at her and said, "You lose." He was not cold. He was not arrogant. By all accounts, he was warm, decent, and deeply considerate. But he had an absolute discipline around language that was almost a moral principle for him. He once said, "I have never been hurt by anything I didn't say." Think about that. Not a motivational quote, a practical observation from a man who spent his life in the most verbally demanding environment imaginable, politics. A man who watched colleagues destroy their careers with words. Who watched alliances crumble because someone said something at the wrong moment. Who watched men who were brilliant and well-intentioned lose everything because they could not stop talking. Coolidge's restraint was not timidity. He was commander-in-chief. He made real decisions. He had genuine political power. He simply understood that words were not free. Every word you speak is either building your reputation or eroding it. Every unnecessary word is a withdrawal from a limited account. And the man who speaks carefully, who guards his account, who only spends words on things worth spending them on, that man ends his life richer in credibility, influence, and respect than the man who spent freely and thoughtlessly. I have never been hurt by anything I didn't say. How many times in your life have you been hurt by something you said? By the reactive comment. The argument you won but shouldn't have entered. The opinion you volunteered that nobody needed. The defense you mounted when staying quiet would have been more powerful. The 3 silences protect you from all of it. Silence as the root of self-mastery. Every tradition that has produced truly great men has had silence at its center. The Stoics called it the practice of the morning, sitting in quiet before the day began, reviewing your principles, settling the mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations as a private journal of this morning practice. He never intended them for publication. They were his silence made visible, his daily discipline of reviewing who he intended to be before the world made its demands. The samurai had the practice of makuso, a few minutes of deep silence before training and before battle. Not to empty the mind, but to gather it. To bring all scattered attention into focus. To remember what was real before the noise of the day buried it. These were not passive men. Marcus Aurelius commanded the largest empire on earth. The samurai were the most elite warriors in Japanese history. Their power came from silence. The story of the scholar and the cup of tea. There is a story of a young scholar who traveled to visit a great master. The scholar was educated, ambitious, full of theories and questions. He arrived and immediately began talking, laying out everything he knew, everything he had studied, everything he believed. The master listened. And then he offered the scholar a cup of tea. He poured. And poured. The tea filled the cup, reached the brim, and kept going. It overflowed onto the table, onto the floor. The scholar jumped up. Stop. The cup is full. It can't hold any more. The master stopped. And looked at him. You are like this cup. You are full of your own opinions and ideas. How can I show you anything unless you first empty your cup? Silence is the emptying of the cup. It is the practice of coming to each moment without the weight of everything you've already decided. Without the armor of every conclusion you've already reached. Without the noise of every opinion you formed before the evidence was in. The man who practices silence becomes capable of learning in a way that the noisy man never can. Because the noisy man is always defending what he already knows. He cannot receive new information, because there is no room for it. The silent man is always updating. Always refining. Always more accurate than he was yesterday, because he is willing to sit in the question longer than the answer is comfortable. This is the root of self-mastery. Not the discipline of forcing yourself to do hard things, though that matters. But the deeper discipline of being willing to not know, to not react, to not perform, and to sit in that space long enough for something real to emerge. The discipline that changes everything. Let's bring this home. You came to this video because something in the title resonated. Because you understand, at some level, that real power doesn't announce itself. That the men who actually shape things, in business, in families, in history, are not usually the loudest voices. That there is something about stillness that you have felt but perhaps not been able to name. The rule of the 3 silences is that name. The silence before you speak, the pause that signals you are not afraid of the moment, that your words come from thought, not anxiety. The pause that gives you clarity and gives the room gravity. The silence while others speak, the complete presence, the full listening, that makes you the most trusted person in any room. The silence that gathers intelligence, builds loyalty, and gives you understanding that the talker never gets. The silence after you've won, the restraint that proves your strength is real, not performed. The stillness of the man who doesn't need the validation of the crowd to know his own value. These 3 practices are not complicated. But they are hard. Because they require you to go against every reactive instinct, every social pressure, every cultural signal that tells you noise is presence and volume is power. They require you to be, in every sense of the word, a man who has done the inner work. Marcus Aurelius and the empty hour. Every morning, before the business of the empire began, before the generals, the senators, the petitioners, the campaigns, the disasters, Marcus Aurelius took an hour. He sat in silence. He wrote in his private journal. He reviewed his principles. He asked himself, who do I intend to be today? What do I need to remember? Where did I fail yesterday, and how do I approach that honestly? He was the most powerful man on earth. He commanded Rome at its height. And every single morning, before he exercised any of that power, he was quiet. Not because he had nothing to do, but because he understood that everything he was about to do would be shaped by the quality of his mind in that moment. And the only way to sharpen the mind, to clear it, to bring it fully to bear on what mattered, was silence. He wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." That retreat is available to you. Right now. Not in some future version of your life when things slow down. Not when the stress is gone, or the schedule opens up. Now. In the 1 second of pause before you speak. In the complete attention you give to someone speaking. In the discipline that stops when it should stop. The 3 silences. Start practicing them today. Not perfectly. Not all at once. Just begin. Notice when you are about to rush a response, and pause. Notice when your mind is building your next sentence while someone is still talking, and come back. Notice when you have won a moment and the ego wants more, and stop. 1 rule. 3 silences. A completely different life. If this spoke to you, if something in this video landed, then you are exactly the kind of man this channel is built for. Inner Steel exists for the man who is serious about his inner world, about building real character, about becoming someone who can face what life throws at him without breaking. Subscribe to Inner Steel. Every week we go deeper. Into the philosophy. Into the stories. Into the practical work of building a man who is genuinely unshakable, not because nothing ever hits him, but because he has built something inside himself that holds when everything outside is shaking. That's what we do here. This is Inner Steel. And you are exactly where you're supposed to be.